Detroit, 2 a.m. A 45,000 square foot store, empty, except it isn't. A woman moves through the dark aisles with a mop and a bucket and hands so cracked from chemicals that she stopped feeling them weeks ago. She has been here since 10. She will leave at 6. She will be back at 2 tomorrow. She has done this for 3.5 years. And the man whose name is on the building has never once seen her face. Somewhere across the city, in a corner office that costs more per square foot than her monthly rent, a CEO is looking at numbers that tell him everything is fine. Labor costs down, efficiency up, zero complaints, zero. In a store where a pregnant woman stands for 9 hours a day because nobody offered her a chair. In a store where a manager sits behind glass and draws a red line through a woman's hours, not because she didn't work them. Because she did. And then, one email, 3 sentences, sent to a personal address that almost nobody had. You built this for people like us. Come see what's happening to them. He read it 4 times. Then he did something nobody expected. He went. He owned 47 stores, 3,000 employees, and he had no idea that one of his workers was sitting on a bathroom floor in his own building, holding a hospital bill she couldn't pay, while he looked out at the city from 43 floors up. That was the thing about views like this one. They made everything look clean. James Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, and Spence watched Detroit wake up below him. The river catching the early light, the bridge to Canada in the distance. The streets laid out in a grid that looked orderly from up here, purposeful, like someone had thought it all through. He had grown up 4 miles from this building, in a neighborhood that did not look orderly from any angle. He was 62 years old. He wore suits that cost more than his father had made in a month. He had a driver named Gerald who showed up at 7:15 every morning without being asked. He had an assistant named Courtney who remembered everything he forgot, which was more than he liked to admit most days. He had built Caldwell Retail Group from nothing. 18 years, 47 stores across 9 states, the kind of story that ended up in business magazines with his face on the cover, and words like visionary and trailblazer underneath it. He had stopped reading those articles years ago, not because they were wrong, because they made him feel like the story was finished. He was still at the window when Courtney knocked and told him his 8 a.m. had arrived early. He turned away from the view, straightened his jacket, became again the man the room expected. He was good at that. The morning moved the way mornings moved when you ran a company of this size. Back to back. Numbers and decisions, and people who needed things from him, each one reasonable on its own, each one adding weight. By 10:30, he was 2 meetings deep and already thinking about the third. That was when the email came. Not to the company account, not through Courtney. To the personal address that 6 people in the world had checked himself on a separate phone, the one he used for his daughter and his attorney, and the 2 friends from before the money who still called him James instead of Mr. Caldwell. He almost didn't see it. He had the phone face down on the desk during meetings as a habit, a discipline he'd picked up years ago when he noticed conversations he was half present for. He picked it up during a break between the 2nd and 3rd meeting and saw the notification. Unknown sender. No subject line. He opened it. You built this for people like us. Come see what's happening to them. Store 14. Detroit. Don't call ahead. That was the whole message. 3 sentences. No name, no explanation, no demand. He read it 4 times. Then he set the phone down and sat with it for a moment. The 3rd meeting was starting in 4 minutes. He could hear voices gathering in the conference room down the hall. He picked up his desk phone and called Sandra Pruitt. Sandra had been his head of HR for 11 years. She was the kind of person who knew where everybody was buried, professionally speaking, and had never once used that knowledge against anyone. She was methodical, honest, and completely without interest in office politics, which made her, in James's experience, one of the rarest types of person in corporate America. She picked up on the second ring. He read her the email. The silence that followed was the kind that meant she was choosing her words with care. "James," she said. "That's not the first one." He sat up straighter. "How many?" A pause, longer than the first. 4 total, in the past 9 months. The first 3 came through the internal reporting system. They were flagged, reviewed, and closed. She stopped. Then, by Victor. James said nothing. Victor Langley, Regional Director for the Midwest Division. 15 years with Caldwell Retail Group. The man who had been sitting in the front row the day James rang the exchange bell. The man who still called every year on the company's founding anniversary, just to say he remembered where they'd started. The man James had trusted with more than almost anyone. "Closed how?" James asked. His voice was even. He was practiced at even. Marked resolved. No further action required. No follow-up interviews. No site visites. Sandra's voice was careful. The reports just stopped going anywhere. James looked out the window, at the city, at the view that made everything look clean. "Send me everything you have," he said. And Sandra, "Don't tell anyone we spoke." He hung up, sat for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket again, and walked down the hall to the conference room. He ran the 3rd meeting. He was present for all of it. But some part of him was already in Detroit, on the ground, asking the question he should have asked months ago. He drove himself down, not in the company car, not with Gerald. He rented a sedan with 60,000 miles on it and a passenger seat that smelled faintly of someone else's coffee. And he drove south from this office into the city he had grown up in and hadn't lived in for nearly 30 years. He stopped at a Goodwill store on the east side. Spent 40 minutes finding clothes that fit right. Not poor-looking. That wasn't the point. And he was self-aware enough to know the difference between poverty and the costume of it. Just worn, lived in. The kind of clothes a man wore when he wasn't thinking about what he was wearing, because he had other things to think about. Jeans with a faded crease from previous ownership. A gray work shirt, long-sleeved, soft from washing. A jacket with a zipper that caught on the 3rd tooth every time. Steel-toed boots, barely used. Probably someone else's wrong size that had become his right one. He stood in front of the fitting room mirror and looked at himself for a long time. He looked like his father, not in a comfortable way. The cover story was simple. He had done versions of this twice before, the company's early years, when he was small enough to walk into a store without anyone knowing his face. He knew the shape of it. You needed a name, a background, a reason to be there that made sense to whoever was doing the hiring. Jim Cole, Maintenance and Facilities. Let go from a warehouse operation in Ohio when the company restructured and cut the entire facilities department in one afternoon. Needed steady work. Not particular about the job. Just reliable, just showed up, just didn't cause problems. The kind of man Garrett Shaw's file suggested he would find useful. He had read Garrett Shaw's file twice on the drive down. Store manager, Store 14, Detroit. 38 years old, 4 years with Caldwell Retail Group. Performance reviews that were, on paper, almost suspiciously clean. Labor cost down 21% over 3 years. Ratings in the top quartile for the region. 0 formal HR complaints in the past 12 months. 0. In a store with 46 employees. James had managed enough people in his life to understand what 0 complaints actually meant. It didn't mean everyone was happy. It meant everyone had learned that complaining made things worse. He checked into a budget hotel 3 miles from the store under his real name. He wasn't running a fraud operation, just an investigation, and spent the evening in the room going through what Sandra had sent him. The internal reports were thin. Each one had come in through the anonymous reporting portal, flagged standard, assigned to Victor Langley's office for regional review, and closed within a week. The closure notes were identical in structure, which was itself a thing worth noting. Matter reviewed. No policy violations found. Case closed. No detail about what had been reviewed. No record of any interviews or site visits. Just closure. The 4th email, the one sent 9 months to his personal address, the one that had finally reached him, was different in tone from the others. Less formal, more tired. "I don't know if this goes anywhere," the sender had written. "I've tried the right channels. Nothing happens. I'm telling you directly because I don't have anywhere else to go. The people in that store are being taken apart slowly, and nobody is stopping it." James read that last sentence twice. Taken apart slowly. He set his laptop aside, lay back on the bed, looked at the stone stain on the hotel, seeing that someone had painted over without fixing the leak. So the paint had bubbled and the stain had come back darker than before. He thought about that. About the way some problems looked fixed from the surface. He set his alarm for 5:30 and closed his eyes. He arrived at the store at 8:45 on a Wednesday morning, sat in the rental car for a moment before going in. The building looked like every other Caldwell location. Same facade design, same logo, same automatic doors with the same sound when they opened, a small exhale of conditioned air. He had approved that design himself years ago, because he wanted his stores to approach comfortable, like a place ordinary people felt comfortable walking into. He wondered, sitting there, whether he had ever actually asked ordinary people how they felt about it. He got out of the car and went through the employee entrance. The store was in its morning rhythm, the floor crew moving with the efficient half-attention of people who knew their route. Registers opening. Stock being faced on the shelves closest to the entrance, where customers would see it first. The particular low-grade hum of a retail space before it hits full capacity. James found the manager's office near the back and knocked twice. Garrett Shaw opened the door. Younger than his file suggested somehow. Sharper looking. He had the kind of face that arranged itself differently, depending on who was standing in front of it. James recognized the skill because he had developed some version of it himself years ago, before he had enough power that he no longer needed to perform. Right now, looking at a man in worn jeans and a jacket with catching zipper, the face said, "Assessing utility." "Help you?" "Jim Cole." James extended his hand, firm, no hesitation. "I heard you might have something in maintenance. I'm good with my hands. I don't need direction. I need steady work." Garrett took the hand, shook it once, let it go. Already reading the situation, already sorting. "Where were you before?" "Worse outside Columbus. Whole facilities department went in one afternoon. Budget restructure." James kept his eyes level, not too eager, not too careful. Just a man who had been in this position before and knew how to hold himself in it. "I do basic repairs, electrical, HVAC filters, general upkeep, whatever you need." Garrett looked him over the way a person looked at somethings they were deciding whether to buy. "References?" James handed him a folded page. Sandra had arranged 2 numbers that would answer correctly. Garrett glanced at it and set it on his desk without reading it closely, which told James something about how much the man actually cared about verifying the people he hired. "Night shift starts at 10 p.m. Days are variable. I call when I need coverage and I expect people to answer. Pay is $14 an hour. 30-day probationary period." Garrett leaned back slightly in his chair. "I run a tight operation here. People who show up, work hard, and stay out of things that don't concern them do fine. People who want to ask a lot of questions or get into other people's business don't usually last." He said it pleasantly. "The way you might describe a scheduling perk." "Understood," James said. "Good." Garrett handed over a temporary badge. "Sandra in HR will finish your paperwork. You start tonight." James looked down at the badge. "Jim Cole, maintenance." He clipped it to his jacket, walked out of the office. Stood for a moment in the main aisle of the store he owned. Watched the morning crew work. And started learning what his own company actually looked like from the inside. He was standing near the service corridor, getting a sense of the building's layout when he heard it. Not crying, exactly. More the sound a person made when they were working very hard not to cry, and the effort was costing them something. It came from behind the door of the employee restroom at the far end of the hallway. Low, controlled. The sound of someone who had learned must make themselves small even inside their own pain. James stood still, He thought about walking past. He was here to observe. Getting involved in something on the first morning before he'd learned anything would only complicate the cover. He knew that. He told himself that clearly. He walked to the door and knocked, gently, twice. The sound stopped. A pause. "I'm fine," a woman's voice, controlled but only barely. "Just give me a minute." "Take your time," James said. "I'm not going anywhere." He wasn't entirely sure why he said that last part. It came out before he decided to say it. Nearly 4 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Ruth Garland was 41 years old. He would learn that later from her file. Standing in that hallway, she looked older, in the way people looked older when they were tired, in a way that sleep didn't touch. Dark circles that had nothing to do with last night. Her custodial uniform was clean but wrinkled, the kind of wrinkle from a hamper rather than a closet. She was holding a piece of paper. James saw the letterhead before she folded it. A hospital logo. And a number with a $sign in front of it that made something in his chest go still. She folded the paper quickly and reached down for her name badge, which had fallen from her uniform and was lying on the wet tile of the hallway floor. Her hands were shaking enough that she missed it the first time. James had crouched down and picked it up. Ruth Garland. Custodial staff. He handed it to her. She took it without looking at his face. "I'm Jim," he said. "Just started today." She pinned the badge back on. Steadied her hands through what looked like deliberate effort. "Ruth, you sure you're okay?" That reflex moved across her face. The automatic yes. The one that kept things moving and kept the wrong people from looking too closely. He could see her almost say it. Then she didn't. Maybe she was too tired to maintain it. Maybe the paper in her pocket was too heavy to carry and perform composure at the same time. "My daughter has a heart condition," she said quietly. "She needs surgery, and I've been here 3.5 years, and the insurance still hasn't kicked in because they keep saying I'm part-time. But I'm not part-time. I work full hours, She stopped. "I can't get anyone on the paperwork." James looked at her. He could have said something smoothing. Something that would make the next 60 seconds easier to move through. He had said things like that many times, in conference rooms, on calls, in situations designed to move past discomfort efficiently. "That doesn't sound right," he said, because it didn't. Ruth made a short sound, not quite a laugh. "No, it doesn't." She straightened up, squared her shoulders, the way people did when they decided to keep going regardless. "Welcome to store 14, she said, and she walked back out onto the floor. James stood in the hallway alone for a moment. He thought about the number on that piece of paper, the hospital's letterhead. Then he followed her out. The rest of the morning taught him things that no quarterly report had contained. He learned that the supply closet near the east entrance had been locked for 6 weeks because Garrett had misplaced the key and told no one to replace it, which meant the custodial staff walked supplies from the back stockroom every single time they needed to restock. Multiple trips per shift across a 45,000 square foot floor, carrying what should have been available 30 feet away. He learned that Diane Foster, 29 years old and visibly pregnant, since maybe 8, had been standing on concrete flooring for 9 hours a day because Garrett had told her store policies didn't include seating for cashiers. James exactly what the store policy said. He had written it. It said nothing of the kind. He found Dion Briggs in the electronics section mid-morning. Dion was 31, careful with his words, and possessed the quiet competence of someone who had been passed over enough times that he'd stopped expecting recognition and just kept doing the work anyway. He'd been at store 14 for 4 years. James asked him how things ran. Dion debbed them. Not with complaint. More with the tone of someone explaining the terms of a situation they had made their peace with, while never actually accepting it. Hours are supposed to be consistent if you're full-time, Dion said. They were both standing near the cable display, looking at it without seeing it. But the schedule changes, sometimes a lot of hours, sometimes not enough to cover rent. Hard to plan around, Hard to stay above the threshold you need for benefit if the documented hours keep shifting. A pause. Funny thing is the store's never not busy. We're always understaffed. The hours are there. They just don't always end up in the system that way. James nodded slowly. He was building something in his mind. Not just a picture of what was happening. A map. The outline of something deliberate. He had seen careless management. He had seen neglect, indifference, laziness at the supervisory level. He knew what those looked like. This had edges. This had design. He saw Garrett in action for the first time at 11:45. Ruth was mopping the main aisle near the checkout lanes. The floor was immaculate. James could see the reflection of the overhead lights in it. Garrett came down the aisle, slowed, stopped, and studied the floor with the expression of a man who was looking for a problem rather than assessing whether one existed. Garland. Ruth stopped mopping. This floor still has streaking. What have you been doing for the past 2 hours? Both James and Ruth looked at the floor. The floor was spotless. I'll go over it again, Ruth said. Her voice was level, practiced. The particular level of someone who had learned that responding with anything except agreement made the next 5 minutes worse. You should have done it right the first time. Garrett's voice never rose. The control came from the quiet, from the fact that he never needed volume because the power arrangement made volume unnecessary. Come see me after your break. Bring your timesheet. He walked away. Ruth watched him go, didn't look at James. Picked up the mop and went back to a floor she had already cleaned. James stood still and watched her. He had been in difficult rooms, hard negotiations, meetings where the power was distributed unequally and everyone present understood it without it being stated. He knew what it looked like when authority was used to control rather than to lead. He had just watched it happen to a woman holding a mop in front of a floor that was already clean. He didn't follow Garrett. Not yet. But he understood, in that moment, that the Rouse hospital bill and the lock on the East supply closet and the 9 hours Diane Foster stood on concrete and the schedule that never quite added up to full time. These were not separate problems. They were expressions of the same thing. Someone running a system. And the system was working exactly as intended. At noon, Garrett called Ruth into his office. James watched from the break room, not the room itself, but through the glass partition that separated it from the manager's area. Garrett sat. Ruth stood. That arrangement was not accidental. He saw her hands clasped behind her back, the posture of someone who had learned to hold themselves together in rooms like this one. Dion came in and sat down beside James with a sandwich he didn't eat. Third time this week, Dion said quietly. James kept his eyes on the glass. Does she ever say anything back? Last person who pushed back ended up with a performance review that appeared in her file 2 weeks later. For things that happened before the review period even started. Dion set the transcript down. She resigned a month after that. Voluntarily, the paperwork said. Through the glass, James watched Garrett take out a red pen, watched him draw a line through something on the document in front of him, watched Ruth's jaw tighten, watched her nod. The hours, James said. Who changes them in the system? Always gets done from the manager login. Dion said it the way he said most things, without heat, just fact. I know because I've seen the timestamps. Changes go in after a shift ends. Sometimes the next morning. James looked away from the glass. 41 people in this store. If one manager was doing this to the people James had already met, how many others had adapted the same way Ruth had? Quietly, without official complaint, treating the gap between what they were owed and what they received as simply the condition of the job. He spent the rest of the afternoon learning the building. The broken fixtures Garrett hadn't requisitioned repairs for. The cleaning supplies running below what corporate allocation specified. The safety equipment, gloves, non-slip mats, anti-fatigue pads, missing from stations that were supposed to have them. Each thing small on its own. Together, they were a portrait. At 5:15, James was in the break room, making notes in his head when Dion appeared in the doorway and tilted his head once toward the back of the building. James followed. They stood near the loading dock, out of sight of the main floor, and Dion spoke in a voice that barely carried. "I want to show you something," Dion said, "but I need you to tell me something first." James waited. "Who are you?" Dion asked. Not aggressive, just direct. The question of a man who had been paying attention and had started to notice inconsistencies. "Someone who needed work," James said. Dion looked at him for a long moment. "Maintenance guys don't usually listen the way you listen." James held his gaze and said nothing. Dion made a decision. James could see it happen. The brief internal calculus, the assessment of risk, the resolution. The emails, Dion said, to corporate. The reporting system. He glanced toward the main floor. "I sent 4 of them. Over 9 cents. The first 3 came back to Victor Langley. I know because the third one came back with a closure notice that had his name on the email chain." He exhaled. "Nothing was investigated. I know that because nothing changed. 2 weeks after the third one, I got a performance improvement plan. First one in 4 years. For productivity benchmarks I'd never been told existed." James kept his face neutral. "The fourth one," he said. "Where did you send it?" "A personal address. Found it through a public filing document. I don't know if it went anywhere." Dion's voice was flat. Not hopeless. Just flat in the way voices went flat when hope had been spent in too many directions and you'd learned to stop showing it. "I stopped expecting anything to happen. I just couldn't stop trying either." James thought about a Tuesday morning, a phone face down on a desk, a notification he'd almost missed. "It went somewhere," he said. Dion looked at him. James didn't say anything more, not yet. But Dion held his gaze for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief, not quite. More like the posture of a man who had been carrying something very heavy and had just, for the first time in a long while, felt another pair of hands reach for it. At 6 p.m., Garrett left. James watched from the break room window. Hard soles on tile, the particular sound of a man who wore his shoes like an announcement. A minute later, a second pulled into the back lot, parked 2 spaces away from Garrett's. James recognized the driver before the door opened. Recognized the silver hair, the deliberate way the man carried himself. The coat had cost what it cost because Victor Langley had always believed in the message that clothes sent before you opened your mouth. James stood absolutely still at the break room window. He watched them talk, brief, professional looking. If you didn't know what you were watching, it looked like nothing. A routine check-in. 2 men in a parking lot, a regional director and a store manager, the kind of thing that happened all the time. Garrett reached into his jacket, handed Victor an envelope. Victor put it in his coat pocket without opening it, without looking down at it. They shook hands. Both got in their cars. Both drove away. James stood at the window and did not move for nearly a full minute. 15 years. That was how long he had known Victor Langley. How long he had trusted him. Given him authority over hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in operations because he believed Victor understood what this company was supposed to be. The man had just taken an envelope in a parking lot. James turned away from the window, walked to the employee exit, got in the rental car, drove to the hotel. The room was the same as he'd left it. He sat down at the small desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up the files Sandra had sent. He started with the quarterly reports. All of them from Victor's division, going back 3 years. He had read these before, every quarter, as part of his standard review process. He had read them looking for problems in the numbers. He had never read them looking for problems in the pobbings. The numbers erased. An hour in, he found what he hadn't been looking for. It was in an appendix attached to a strategic planning document from 18 months ago. A proposal Victor had submitted under the title Workforce Flexibility Initiative. It outlined a framework for giving regional store managers the authority to reclassify employee hours on a rolling basis, based on operational needs. The language was measured, practical, written in the vocabulary of efficiency that James had spent his career responding well to. Seasonal fluctuation management, labor cost optimization, staffing flexibility. He had signed it. He could see his own signature at the bottom of the document. The quick signature of a man who had trusted the person presenting the paper and had four other things happening that afternoon. He sat with that for a while. This document, bearing his name, filed under his authority, was the legal framework Garrett Shaw was using to reclassify Ruth Garland's hours, to keep her below the benefits threshold month after month after month. What Garrett was doing was not just morally wrong. It had been made, through James's own signature, technically defensible. He had not known. But not knowing was not the same as not responsible. He thought about the hospital letterhead, the number with the $sign, the way Ruth had folded the paper before he could read the whole amount. He thought about his father, 30 years cleaning office buildings in this city, knowing every floor plan, every temperamental machine, every shortcut in every building he worked in. Skilled, reliable, completely invisible to everyone above him. James had built this company, in part, because of that. He had said it in speeches. He had meant every word of it. And then he had signed a piece of paper in 45 seconds without reading it carefully enough to understand what it could become in the wrong hands. He closed the laptop, sat in the dark, stayed there long enough to feel the full weight of what he had found. Then he picked up his phone and called Sandra. "The scheduling records," he said. "Ruth Garland. What do they actually show? I pulled them this morning after your call last night." Sandra's voice was careful, professional, but he could hear something underneath it. Her time clock records show between 32 and 40 hours, worked in 41 of the past 43 months. She should have been reclassified as full-time permanent within 90 days of her hire date. A pause. She wasn't. The part-time temporary classification has been maintained through manual edits to the system. All edits trace back to the store manager login. Garrett Shaw. Yes. James looked at the bubbled paint on the ceiling, the leak that had been painted over without being fixed. The insurance denial, he said, follows directly from the classification. If she were correctly classified, she would have been eligible for full benefits approximately 3 years and 4 months ago. 3 years and 4 months. He thought about the surgical window Ruth had described, closing as around age 9. Ava was 8. "Sandra," he said, "don't change anything in the system yet. Don't touch any records. I need a few more days." "How many?" He looked at the window. "At the city beyond it." "Not many," he said. "But I need to understand the full shape of this before we move. If we move too early and leave gaps, someone will use those gaps." "Understood." A pause. "James, be careful." He told her good night and set the phone down. Lay back on the bed. He was tired in the way physical work made a person tired. His body registering the hours on his feet, the weight of the supply cart, the work boots that were someone else's wrong size. But underneath the tiredness was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. The particular alertness of a man who had found the real problem and was not going to look away from it. He set his alarm for 5:30. In the morning, he would go back. He would learn more. He would watch carefully. He would wait until he had everything he needed to make this impossible to dismiss, impossible to reroute through someone like Victor, impossible to bury under a closure notice that said matter reviewed, no violations found. He would wait, but not long. The store changed after closing, not dramatically, not in the way of horror movies or dramatic reveals, just differently. The customer-facing brightness dialed down to a maintenance setting, the overhead lights dropping to something flatter and more honest. The piped-in music cut off at exactly 10:01, mid-song, leaving a silence that had its own texture. The building exhaled, somehow, stopped performing. James arrived for his first night shift at 9:50. Ruth was already there. She had changed into fresh work gloves, her own, not company-issued, because the company supply ran out faster than it was replenished, and she had learned not to wait for things that weren't coming. She was filling a mop bucket near the service entrance when he came through the door, and she looked up when she heard him. "You came back," she said. Not surprised exactly. More like she had placed a careful, private bet on something, and was noting, without celebration, that it had paid. "Told you I needed the work," James said. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, reading something, not quite finding it. Then she handed him a mop. "East wing first," she said. "It's the worst." She wasn't wrong. The East Wing was 4,000 square feet of retail floor that hadn't been properly serviced in what looked like weeks. Not from neglect on Ruth's part. James understood that within the first 20 minutes, but because the overnight crew had been progressively reduced. 3 people to 2, 2 to 1, and on the nights it was just Ruth. The math of what one person could cover in 8 hours simply didn't match the space. They worked without much talking at first. The sound of their work filled the space instead. The wet drag of mops across tile, the squeaks of the cartwheels on the turns, the particular silence of a large building when the people who move through it during the day have gone home and left it to the people who maintain it. James's lower back registered its objection around 11. He didn't say anything. Ruth's pace didn't slow. She moved with the efficiency of someone whose body had memorized the route. Around the display fixtures, down the main aisle, the corner near the restrooms that always collected more than it should, the stretch by the emergency exit, where the floor polish had worn through and needed an extra pass. She didn't have to think about it. She just moved. "How long have you been on nights?" James asked, somewhere around 11:15. "About 2 years." She was wringing out the mop without looking at him. "I put in for a transfer to days when a position opened up." Garrett said it had been filled. 2 weeks later, a new hire started on the day shift. She moved to the next section. "So," James kept moving his mop, "and the hours fluctuate?" She made a sound, not quite a laugh. "Something drier than that. Some weeks 35 hours, some weeks 18. Once I got 11 and still had to come in for a mandatory meeting on my day off, which doesn't count toward the total." She turned at the end of the aisle. "My rent doesn't fluctuate. Funny how that works." James looked at the floor he was cleaning, thought about a document with his signature at the bottom. 45 seconds of his attention, 18 months ago. He said nothing. Around midnight, with the East Wing done and the center aisles half finished, Ruth sat down on an upturned plastic crate near the loading dock and drank from a water bottle that had been refilled so many times the label had worn completely off. James sat on a second crate and did the same. The loading dock was cold, the kind of cold that came through concrete walls and didn't apologize for it. "Her name is Ava," Ruth said. James hadn't asked. She said it the way people said things when they were tired enough that the usual management of what came out of their mouth had gone offline for the night. She was diagnosed when she was 3. A structural problem with one of the valves. The cardiologist explained it to me 3 times before I stopped asking him to repeat it and just started writing things down. She turned the water bottle in her hands. He said the best window for the repair, the window where the outcome is cleanest and the recovery is straightforward, closes around age 9. After that, it gets more complicated. The surgery gets harder, the recovery gets longer. James waited. "Ava is 8, she said. "We're in the window right now. This is it. What does the surgeries cost, Ed?" "With the insurance I'm supposed to have, the insurance I've been supposed to have for 3 years, most of it would be covered. Maybe a small deductible." She looked at the water bottle. "Without it, the estimate is to be between $60,000 and $90,000, depending on what they find." James thought about the check he had signed last quarter for $62,000. It had been a routine vendor payment. He had signed it between 2 phone calls. "Your daughter's father," he said, "left when Ava was 4. Ruth's voice didn't change. No bitterness in it, no performance of acceptance. Just the neutral tone of a fact that had been a fact long enough to lose its sharp edges. He wasn't a cruel person. He was scared. The diagnosis scared him, and he didn't know what to do with scared, so he left. And I've handled this part alone. She looked up, not at James, at the loading dock ceiling, at the industrial light fixture above them with one of its two bulbs burned out. I don't say that for sympathy, she said. I just say it because it's the situation. I know, James said. She looked at him then, just briefly, the look of someone recalibrating something. You're a strange maintenance man, Jim, she said. He almost said something. The moment was right there. But it closed before he found the words that fit inside it. And then Ruth was standing and pulled her gloves back on and saying they needed to finish the West Wing before Garrett came in for his overnight check. So James stood too and went back to work. Garrett arrived at 2:14. James heard him first, the sound of the back entrance opening, the specific cadence of someone who wore shoes as an announcement. Garrett moved through the building with the focused attention of a man conducting an inspection, which what was, though the word that came to James's mind was something closer to surveillance. He found them in housewares. You're behind, he said to Ruth. Ruth stopped mopping. We're on track. My schedule has this section finished by 1:30. Your schedule was written for 3 people. Ruth's voice stayed level. Tonight there are 2. Tonight there are 2, Garrett agreed pleasantly, which is why I expect you to work accordingly. James watched this, the way Garrett held himself in it, the particular satisfaction of a man who had arranged a situation to be impossible and then held the impossibility over someone's head. Not anger, not urgency, satisfaction. Henderson. Garrett used James's cover name without looking at him. When you're through here, I need the backroom pallets moved to the floor before the morning crew comes in. James had seen those pallets, a full delivery, stacked high, he asked. All them? Problem? 1 beat. Just 1. No problem, James said. Garrett looked at Ruth once more, the look of a man confirming that everything was where he had put it, and walked away. Ruth waited until she heard the office door close. Then she looked at James. Don't hurt your back, she said quietly. He won't help, and he'll mark it in your file if you ask someone else to. James looked at the back room door, then at Ruth. How do you do this? He said. Not performed, just honest, every night. Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning it over. I think about Ava, she said. What I'm doing it for, and then I stop thinking and just keep moving. She went back to her section. James stood still for another second. Then he went to move the pallets. He lost count of the trip somewhere after 3 a.m. His lower back had progressed from aching to something more specific and less polite. His hands had developed blisters on the grip points of the pallet jack. Not severe, but real. The kind that came from sustained effort without the calluses that built up over time in people who did this work every day. He kept moving, because he was doing what Ruth did, thinking about why. Around 4 in the morning, Dion Briggs appeared in the break room. James hadn't expected him. The store was supposed to be night staff only after 10. Dion explained briefly that he sometimes came back after hours for inventory counts that Garrett preferred completed before the morning shift. Said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, without seeming to register what he was actually describing. After hours, unpaid. James sat across from him with a paper cup of water and kept his face still. Dion, he said, I want to ask you something directly. Dion looked at him. Go ahead, the emails, the internal reports. James kept his voice below the break room's ambient Someone's store has been sending them, 4 of them, over 9 months. Dion was very still, not surprised. Something more complicated than surprised. I'm not here to cause you trouble, James said. I'm trying to understand what's been happening. And I think you've been trying to tell someone for a long time. A long silence. Dion looked at the table. His hands were flat on it, not tense, just resting. The hands of a man who had stopped bracing for things because bracing didn't help. I sent them, he said. All 4. He looked up. First 3 went through the internal system. Last one I sent direct, to a personal email address I found on a public filing. I don't know if it reached anyone. It did, James said. Dion looked at him. James held his gaze and let that land without adding to it. The improvement plan, James said, after the third email. Appeared in my file 2 weeks after I filed the report. First one in 4 years. Dion's voice was flat in the specific way that voices went flat when someone had processed something past the point of anger. For benchmarks I hadn't been told existed. Garrett walked me through it very calmly. Told me he was trying to help me improve. A pause. He knew I sent it. He couldn't prove it, but he knew. And you kept going. I couldn't stop. Dion said it simply, like it was the only true answer to the question. I kept thinking someone would eventually. He stopped. I kept trying. James looked at his water cup. He thought about a Tuesday morning, a phone he'd almost left face down, a notification he'd nearly deleted. There's something else you need to know, James said. Garrett is narrowing his list. He knows someone in this store has been reporting out. Based on what I've been watching, I think he's identified 2 people he believes are responsible. Dion's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a settling, a stillness, the particular quality of a man who had been waiting for the other shoe and had just heard it. Me and Ruth, he said. That's my read. Timeline? Days. Not weeks. He's building something. He does things slowly enough that each piece looks administrative. By the time he moves, it looks like policy, not retaliation. Dion nodded once. Processing. What do I do? Nothing different. Don't warn Ruth yet. I don't want her to change her behavior in a way that tips him. Don't let him see you shift. James held his eyes. Can you do that? Dion looked at him steadily. Who are you? He said. Not aggressive, just direct. The question of a man who had been paying attention long enough to know that the pieces didn't fit the cover story. James met his gaze. Someone who should have been he a long time ago. It wasn't an answer. Dion knew it wasn't. But he held it for a moment and then nodded. The nod of a man who had decided that what he'd been given was enough to work with. I'll see you tomorrow, Dion said. Yes, James said. You will. Dion stood, rinsed his cup, and left. James sat alone in the break room for a few minutes after he heard the back entrance close. He thought about 4 emails, 9 months. A performance improvement plan used as a warning. A man who kept trying anyway, not because believed it would work, but because he couldn't locate the version of himself that would stop. He stood up, went back to the pallets, finished the job. The next 2 days shaped themselves around a rhythm James hadn't lived in 20 years. He arrived, he worked, he watched. He listened in the particular way that required suppressing every instinct he had developed as a man with authority. The instinct to ask direct questions, to request documentation, to call the people who reported to him and get answers within the hour. None of that was available to Jim Cole. Jim Cole had to learn the way everyone in this building learned things slowly, laterally, through what people said when they weren't being careful and what they didn't say when they were. He learned that the cleaning supply shortage was not an oversight. Garrett had cut the monthly requisite order by 40%. Pocketed the budget difference through a vendor arrangement that Sandra would later document in detail. The custodial staff used what was available and worked around what wasn't. That had historically resulted in being told that efficient workers found ways to manage with available resources. He learned that Diane Foster had asked twice about the seating accommodation for her pregnancy and had been told twice that it wasn't in the store policy. She had stopped asking. She took her break sitting on the floor of the stockroom when she could get away with it, which wasn't often, because the stockroom was on its patrol routes and being found sitting during a non-designated break period had a way of appearing in your file. He watched Garrett operate with the patience of someone studying a system rather than a person. Because that's what it was. Garrett Shaw was not a man who acted on impulse or personal dislike. He had constructed something. A machine schedule software and performance review templates, cultural climate of fear so thoroughly normalized that most of the people inside it had stopped recognizing it as fear and had started calling it just how things are here. The genius of it, in the cold analytical sense of that word, was that every individual piece was deniable. A schedule change was operational. A performance note was managerial feedback. A benefits classification was administrative. An hour deducted from a timesheet was a correction for an error. Nothing alone was clearly wrong. Together, it was a sustained and deliberate theft of time, money, security, and dignity from the people who could least afford to lose any of those things. James documented everything he could without accessing systems he wasn't supposed to have. Mental notes he converted to brief written records in the hotel room each night. Timestamps, patterns, the things he saw with his own eyes. On Friday afternoon, something happened that he hadn't anticipated. Ruth tested him. He recognized it only in retrospect. That evening in the hotel, reconstructing the day. But once he saw it, it was unmistakable. She had mentioned casually that the break room renovation had happened about 18 months ago. He knew it had been 22 months because he had approved the budget for it and remembered the quarter. He had said nothing. An hour later, she mentioned, equally casually, that the store had moved to the new scheduling software in the spring. It had been the previous fall. Again, he'd said nothing. She was giving him information that was slightly wrong and watching to see if he corrected it. He hadn't corrected it, but she had been watching his face when she said it, and faces were harder to control than words. On Saturday morning, she handed him a cleaning supply crate near the east corridor and said, without preamble, "You hold yourself different when Garrett's not in the building." James took the crate. "What do you mean?" "When he's here, you're careful. Measured, like someone performing a role." She looked at him directly. "When he's not, you just stand differently, like the role isn't necessary." James held her gaze. "I'm new. I'm finding my footing." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her own cart and walked away. She didn't push it. That was the thing about her. She had the patience of someone who had learned that pushing things directly produced bad results, and that waiting, watching, holding the question in reserve, those were more effective tools. She was deciding to trust him. He could feel the evaluation happening. He also understood, with a clarity that had been building since that first morning in the hallway, that whatever Ruth decided about him, she was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She had been managing an impossible situation for 3.5 years with the tools available to her. She was going to keep managing it. His presence here was not the turning point for her. It was information, and she was figuring out what to do with it. That understanding shifted something in how he thought about what he was doing here. He had arrived with a clear purpose: investigate, document, take action. The action he'd imagined had James at the center of it. James revealing himself. James making the calls. James fixing what was broken. Standing in that corridor on a Saturday morning, watching Ruth push her cart around the corner, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew the route better than anyone, he began to understand that the story he was inside was not exactly the one he'd thought he was writing. The call came on Sunday afternoon. James was replacing a fluorescent fixture in the storage corridor. The third he'd done that week because Garrett hadn't submitted a maintenance requisition in 4 months, and half the stockroom was running on aging lights that flickered in a way that would have been an OSHA issue if anyone had been looking. He was on a stepladder with a screwdriver when he saw Ruth, 20 feet away near the break room entrance, put her phone to her ear. He watched her face change. It changed the way faces changed when you heard the thing you had been afraid of hearing. Not dramatically. Ruth didn't do dramatic, but all at once, in a single second, the controlled surface of her expression became something else. Something that didn't have a name, but that anyone who had ever received a phone call like that one would recognize immediately. She said something into the phone. He couldn't hear it. Then she ended the call and stood very still for 3 seconds. The 3 a person took to absorb something before their body understood it had to move. Then she walked quickly to Garrett's office and knocked. James came down from the ladder. set the screwdriver on the cart, moved to where he could see the glass partition without being obvious about it. Garrett listened to Ruth with the expression of a man receiving information and sorting its for usefulness rather than responding to it as a human event. Ruth came out 4 minutes later, moving fast, getting her jacket from her locker, her bag, her keys. James stepped into her path without blocking it. Ruth. She stopped, and for just a moment, just a few seconds, the composure that was both her strength and her armor simply wasn't there. He could see everything turning fear and exhaustion, and the particular anguish of a parent who needed to be somewhere and was standing in a building that didn't care. Ava collapsed at school, she said. Her heart. They called an ambulance. She's at St. Catherine's. Something cold moved through James. Not shock. He had been afraid of something like this since she'd described the surgical window. But hearing it said out loud was different from fearing it. Go, he said, right now. Garrett said if I leave without completing the incident log. I don't care what Garrett said. His voice was quiet, but there was nothing soft in it. Go. She looked at him, and he held her gaze with everything he had that was real. Not Jim Cole, not the cover, not the careful measured performance of a man finding his footing. Just James looking at her. Go, he said again. She went. He stood at the service corridor window and watched her car pull out of the employee lot. Watched it reach the street, turn, disappear. Then he turned around and walked to where he could see Garrett's office. Garrett was already at his computer, already working. James could see the HR system open on the screen, the attendance module, the incident log, the field where the record of a shift was kept. He watched Gert type. He could not read the words from where he stood. He didn't need to. He knew what was being written. He had seen Garrett's file. He understood the method. He stood there and watched it happen. Watched Ostman type a few lines into a database that would follow Ruth Garland into every employment decision for the rest of her time at this company. Watched him do it with the casual efficiency of someone performing an administrative task. James did not go in. He needed to go in. Every part of him wanted to go in. He did not. Because if he moved now, without the full picture secured, without every thread documented in a way that couldn't be challenged, rerouted, or buried, Garrett would have time. Victor would have time. Records would be adjusted. The same machine that had been running for years would simply reroute around this moment and keep running. He needed to be certain. He needed to be unassailable. He needed to walk into that store with something so complete that there was no gap left for anyone to slide through. He estimated 2 more days, maybe less, if he moved efficiently tonight. It was the most difficult calculation he had ever made. He went back to the fluorescent fixture, climbed back up the ladder, finished the installation. His hands were completely steady. He did not understand how. He drove to St. Catherine's that night. Didn't go in, sat in the parking lot in the rental car with the engine off and looked at the lit windows of the hospital. The 3rd floor, the 4th. Rooms where things happened that couldn't be scheduled or managed or optimized. Rooms where the only variable that mattered was whether the person in the bed was going to be all right. He thought about Ava, 8 years old and somewhere behind one of those windows in a hospital bed, and her mother sitting next to her in the kind of chair that wasn't designed for comfort. Because comfort wasn't the point of it. He thought about the surgical window, Closington around age 9. He thought about his signature on a document he had reviewed for 45 seconds. His phone was in his hand. He called Sandra. She picked up on the first ring. I need everything ready to move, he said. Not in 2 days. Tomorrow evening. I want to go in Tuesday morning. A pause. Fast. I know. Can it be done? I started building the reclassification documents 3 days ago, Sandra said. I've been pulling records for all 46 employees at Store 14. I have preliminary findings on the misclassified workers. I've flagged 5 additional cases beyond Ruth Garland. She paused. I also need to tell you something, James. I've been cross-referencing the scheduling patterns against the other stores in Victor's division. He already knew what she was going to say. He had known since he'd seen the Workforce Flexibility Initiative filed across all 9 regional locations. "How many stores?" he said. 5 confirmed, possibly a 6th. Same pattern, same mechanism. The initiative gave every manager in Langley's division the identical tool and no oversight structure to constrain how it was used. James looked at the hospital windows. 41 employees affected, maybe more. People in 5 cities who had been having versions of what he'd watched happen in this building. People who had filed internal reports that went nowhere. People who had adapted their lives around schedules that weren't reliable and insurance that never quite kicked in. "Get everyone on standby," he said. "Legal HR investigations. I want to move simultaneously at every location. No advance warning. No opportunity for anyone to begin managing the documentation. Simultaneous across 6 locations is a significant coordination effort. Sandra, I know what it is. Can it be done by Tuesday morning?" A pause, not a hesitation. Calculation. Sandra didn't hesitate. She calculated and then gave you an honest answer. "Yes," she said, "it can be done. Then do it." He sat in the parking lot for a while after he hung up, looked at the hospital windows. He reached into the inside pocket of the work jacket, found what was always there, had been there for 20 years in every jacket he owned because he had never found a reason to move it and had eventually stopped examining why. A piece of paper, folded into quarters, protected by a plastic sleeve that had yellowed at the edges. A job application. His father's handwriting, careful, deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had not gone past 10th grade, but who understood that how you wrote your name said something about how seriously you took what you were doing. Maintenance and Custodial Services, Detroit, Michigan. 31 years ago, his father had gotten that job, had kept it for 12 years, had never been called by his name in the building, always "hey" or "the guy," or, when people were being specific, "the custodian." Had retired with a plaque and a handshake from a building manager who couldn't have picked him out of a room of 3. James had been carrying this application for 20 years because it was the thing he looked at when he needed to remember what he was building toward. He looked at it now. He thought about Ruth moving through an empty store at 2 in the morning, her body knowing the route without being told. He thought about Dion's 4 emails, 9 months, not stopping because he couldn't find the version of himself that would stop. He thought about Diane Foster sitting on a stockroom floor during breaks because she just to sit and couldn't do it where anyone could see. He thought about the word his father had never been called. In the building where he had worked for 12 years. James put the application back in his pocket, started the car, drove back to the hotel. In the room, he took off the work boots, someone else's wrong size that had become his right one, and set them by the door. Sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet off it in the way hotel rooms were quiet at midnight. The particular silence of a space that didn't belong to anyone and held nothing of consequence except the person currently inside it. He thought about what the next 2 days would require. It would be clean if he did it right. Complete. The kind of action that couldn't be walked back or rerouted because everything would happen at once. Simultaneously, with no jabop between the moment of revelation and the moment of remedy. He had done large things before. Negotiations that changed the company's direction. Acquisitions that took months to structure. Decisions that affect people in ways he understood only abstractly as aggregate outcomes. This was not abstract. He knew the name of the woman he was going to help. He had mopped floors beside her. He had heard her describe the window that was closing around her daughter's life. He had watched her fold a hospital bill before he could read the full number. He set his alarm, lay back, and thought, before sleep came, about the supply closet on the east wing. 6 weeks with a broken lock. A simple fix. The kind of thing that got lost when no one in authority thought it was worth paying attention to. He would fix that too. Start there and work out. He was asleep before 11. The deepest sleep he'd had since arriving in Detroit. The sleep of a man who had spent a week learning something he should have known years ago, and who was now, finally, ready to act on it. James didn't sleep that night. Not the way he had slept the previous nights, deep and immediate, the sleep of a body that had earned it. This was different. He lay on the bed in the dark and ran through everything, not anxiously, methodically. The way he had always prepared for things that mattered. The timesheet edits, Garrett's login, timestamps Sandra had pulled, Ruth's reclassification, maintained through manual adjustments for 3 years and 4 months. The Workforce Flexibility Initiative, his own signature at the bottom, 45 seconds of his attention that had become someone else's legal cover. The parking lot, Victor's coat pocket, the envelope that disappeared without being opened. Dion's 4 emails, 9 months of trying. Diane Foster on a stockroom floor during breaks because she needed to sit and had nowhere to do it where Garrett wouldn't see. Ruth folding a hospital bill before he could read the full number. He ran through all of it, not because he needed to. He had it memorized, had turned it over so sanctomises in the past week that it had worn smooth in his mind. He ran through it because he wanted to walk in that building carrying the full weight of it. Not just the legal architecture, the human cost, every name, every face, every small daily indignity that had been engineered to be too small to fight and too constant to survive without damage. He wanted to feel all of it before he ended it. The alarm was set for 5:30. At 5:15, he was already sitting up, already dressed, the work boots by the door where he'd left them the night before. He called Sandra at 6. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me," he said. "All 5 locations are confirmed and ready." Her voice had the particular quality of someone who had been awake several hours and was running on the clarity that came after tiredness rather than before it. Legal teams are positioned at each site. HR specialists are staged and ready to begin reclassification processing the moment you give the word. The federal referral documentation is prepared. Wage theft statutes, benefit fraud, conspiracy. It goes out the moment Garrett Shaw is removed from the premises. Victor. Corporate counsel has been briefed. They're prepared to move on Victor simultaneously with the store action. His system access is shit queued for suspension. It goes through the moment you confirm you're ready at store 14. A pause. James. His attorneys are already aware is coming. He has people watching. How? I don't know. But one of his assistants made 3 calls to outside counsel yesterday afternoon. Sandra's voice was steady. It doesn't change what we're doing. It just means we move fast and we move complete. That's what we're doing. James looked at his reflection in the dark window. The work jacket, the boots, the temporary badge he hadn't clipped on yet. The employee records, Ruth Garland first, ready to process the moment the reclassification is confirmed. Back pay calculation is complete. 3 years and 4 months of the differential between part-time and full-time compensation. The number is substantial. A pause. The insurance situation is more complicated. I've spoken to the carrier. Given the circumstances, documented employer or fraud in the classification, they've agreed to treat this as a retroactive enrollment correction. Ava's case has been flagged as medical priority. The authorization won't process in hours, James. Realistically, we're looking at end of week for full confirmation. But the carrier has committed in writing, and I have that documentation ready to show Ruth today. End of week. Not this morning, not the clean, instant resolution he had imagined, but real, committed, in writing. That's honest, he said. Good. I'll tell her that. There's one more thing. Sandra's voice shifted slightly, the shift of someone about to say something that required care. I found something in the records last night. The employee who worked the shift directly before Ruth the night Ava collapsed. Garrett coded that shift as overtime, billed to a different cost center. The hours matched the time Ruth was on the floor. He was double billing labor he wasn't paying out. She paused. It's not the largest number in this case, but it's the clearest single instance of direct wage theft with a paper trail that leads straight to him personally. Add it to the package, already done. James picked up the badge from the nightstand. Jim Cole. Maintenance. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it in his jacket pocket instead of clipping it on. He would carry it in. He would set it down when the time came. But he wasn't going to wear it into the building this morning. He had worn it long enough. Sandra, he said, thank you for all of it. Go finish it, she said. He drove to the store in the early morning dark. He arrived at 7. The morning crew was coming in. He held the employee entrance door for a woman he recognized from the checkout lanes. She thanked him without looking at his face, already thinking about whatever the day required. He said, good morning. She was past him before he finished the word. He moved through the store the way he had moved through it every day for a week, quietly, with purpose, stopping to address the things that needed addressing. A display that had come loose from its mounting overnight, a quote floor sign left in the middle of an aisle from an overnight spill that someone hadn't returned to the closet. The ordinary maintenance of a space that held 46 people for 8 to 10 hours a day. He looked at everything differently now than he had a week ago. Not with fresh eyes, that was the wrong way to describe it. He had been in retail spaces his whole career. He had walked store floors hundreds of times, but he had walked them as the man who owned them, which meant he had walked them looking for what confirmed what he already believed. Neat shelves, clean floors, staff who looked busy and smiled at customers. He had not walked them looking for the lock that had been broken for 6 weeks, 'cause no one with authority had thought it was worth fixing. He passed the East Wing supply closet. The lock was still broken. Of course it was. He made a note, a real one this time, typed into his actual phone, to have it repaired today. Not through the usual requisition process, today. At 8:30, Garrett arrived. Hard soles on tile, the office door, the click of it closing. James kept working. At 9 a.m., his phone vibrated once. Sandra's text, ready. He typed back, 1 hour. He found Dion in the electronics section at 9:15. Dion was reorganizing a display of charging cables with the methodical attention of someone who needed his hands to be doing something while his mind was elsewhere. James stood beside him and looked at the same display. Today, James said quietly. Dion's hands stilled for just a second, then kept moving. How bad's it going to be? Dion asked. Accurate. Very. James kept his voice level. For everyone else in this building, it's going to be different after today than it was before. Different in ways I should have made possible a long time ago. Dion set down a cable, picked up another. The performance improvement plan, he said. My file, gun by end of day. Along with every retaliatory document Garrett created to protect himself. James paused. And Dion, we're going to talk this week about what you want to do next. Not what I think you should do, what you want. Dion looked at him sideways, the look of a man who had spent 4 years being told what his limitations were. Okay, he said, quietly, like a door opening. James nodded and walked back toward the main floor. At 9:40, Garrett came out of his office and walked to the scheduling station near the customer service desk. He spent 10 minutes there, making changes on the tablet. James watched from the hardware section, one aisle over, at an angle that let him observe without being observed. He watched Garrett's hands on the tablet, the efficiency of it. A man who had done this so many times that it required no thought, just execution. Hours adjusted, classifications maintained, the machine tended, James thought, the last time. At 9:55, the employee entrance opened. Ruth Garland walked in. James saw her from across the floor and felt something release in his chest that had been held tight since Sunday afternoon in a hospital parking lot. She was tired. The kind of tired that 2 days at a hospital bedside produced, the kind that showed in the set of the shoulders, the slight deliberateness of each step, the body doing what was required through an act of will rather than ease. But she had come. She had clocked in. She was here. She crossed the floor toward the custodial station without looking at Garrett's office. James gave her 5 minutes to get settled. Then he walked to where she was preparing her cart. How is she? He said quietly. Ruth looked at him. The question behind her eyes. How do you know to ask that? moved across her face, and then moved away. Stable, she said. They're monitoring. The cardiologist wants to do the surgery within the next 10 days. He said the sooner the better. She clipped a supply bottle to the cart. I told him we were working on the insurance situation. You can tell him it's being handled, James said. Today, Ruth stopped what she was doing, looked at him. He held her gaze and let her read whatever was in it. She didn't ask him to explain. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had been looking at him all week, reading, assessing, deciding, and then she nodded once. Small and certain. She went back to her cart. James checked his watch. 3 minutes. The staffs had gone out through the scheduling system at 8 a.m. Mandatory team meeting, 10 o'clock customer service area. All staff, no exceptions, no subject, no explanation. James had known about it since 7:30, when Sandra had intercepted the notification as part of the system monitoring she'd had in place for 3 days. He knew what it was for. Garrett had been building toward this since Sunday afternoons, since he'd typed those lines into Ruth's incident log. This was the closing move. 16 employees gathered near the customer service desk at 10 o'clock. Some from the morning crew, some who had come in specifically for the meeting. Faces James had learned over the past week. He knew their names now, their departments, their shifts, their situations. The teenager, who worked weekends and sent half his check to his mother in another state. The woman in kitchen supplies, who had been waiting 11 months for a promised promotion that kept being deferred. The overnight stalker, who wore the same 3 shirts in rotation because he was supporting a family on $14 an hour. Diane Fawn Foster stood at the edge of the group, 8 months pregnant, no chair. Her hand pressed to the small of her back with the automatic gesture of someone who had been doing that for weeks. Dion stood near the back, arms at his sides, face completely neutral, the practiced stillness of a man who had learned that in rooms like this one, stillness was the only safe posture. Ruth stood to the left of the group, slightly apart, slightly back. Her hands were at her sides. She was looking at the middle distance with the focused calm of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the moment to act on it. James stood at the back. He had the temporary badge in his jacket pocket, his real credentials in the other one. He was waiting. Garrett came out of his office at 2 minutes past 10. Clipboard. The walk of a man who considered the room already his. Good morning. He scanned the group the way you scanned a room you were responsible for, assessing presence, confirming arrangement. I'll keep this brief. We've had some attendance issues this week that I need to address directly, because I believe in being transparent with this team. He let that settle. Transparent. James watched the faces around the group, the careful blankness that had been learned over months and years, the way no one looked at anyone else, the particular loneliness of people in the same situation who had been prevented from recognizing it in each other. Ruth Garland, Garrett said. He said her name the way you stated a line item. Ruth left her shift 2 days ago without completing the required incident documentation and without obtaining manager authorization. She has 2 recorded violations in the current review period. Under our attendance policy, that constitutes grounds for termination review. He looked at her, not cruelly, clinically. Effective today, Ruth, you're being placed on administrative suspension pending a formal termination proceeding. I'll need your badge before you leave, and you can collect your personal belongings from your locker. 15 people. Absolute silence. The fluorescent hum. The distant sound of a register opening in another part of the store. Someone's phone vibrating in their pocket and being quickly pressed to silence. Ruth didn't move toward the exit. She moved toward the customer service table. She set something down on it. A folder. Plain, manila. Thick. The thickness of 4 months of careful, private documentation. She opened it and placed the first page on the table with the deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment alone, many times, in the small hours of mornings when the fear of doing it had been louder than the knowledge that it needed to be done. I've been here 3.5 years, she said. Her voice was quiet, steady in the way of something that has been tested repeatedly and has not broken. I have clocked in for every shift I was scheduled for. I worked through a flu in February because I couldn't afford to miss the hours. I came in on a scheduled day off 4 times in the past year when I was called. I have never received a written performance warning. She placed the second page on the table. This is my time clock records for the past 22 months, printed from the system before the manual edits were applied. 32 to 40 hours, nearly every week. Third page. This is a record of the scheduling adjustments made to my documented hours after each pay period closed, pulled from the system's edit history. Fourth page. This is the log I've been keeping since January. Every incident, every conversation, every adjustment made to my file that I was not informed of at the time it was made. She looked up. At Garrett. I left my shift on Sunday because my 8-year-old daughter was transported by ambulance to the hospital with a cardiac event. Her voice did not rise, did not waver. I called in before I left. I spoke to the shift supervisor on duty. I followed the procedure in the employee exactly as it is written. What you entered into my file is not what happened. The room was not breathing. Garrett's face had not broken. The professional surface was still technically in place. But underneath it, something had shifted. The particular recalibration of a man whose machine had just encountered something it wasn't built to handle. Ruth. He kept his voice measured, reasonable. The voice of a man offering patience to someone who was making things harder than they needed to be. I understand you've been under significant personal stress. I'm not under stress, she said, simply. I'm right. One beat. James took his hand out of his pocket, walked forward through the group. People stepped aside, not because they understood what was happening, because something in how he moved communicated that this was where he had always been going. He stopped at the table, reached into his jacket pocket, set down the temporary badge, Jim Cole, maintenance, then reached into the other pocket, set the second badge beside it, hard-edged, his photograph, his name, his title, the company logo he had chosen himself 18 years ago because he had wanted something that looked permanent. James Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer, Caldwell Retail Group. The room processed this at different speeds. Then Dion said, very quietly from the back of the group, "Oh," and the room understood. Garrett recovered faster than James had expected, or tried to. Mr. Caldwell. The name deployed immediately the acknowledgement of a man pivoting. I want to explain the context here. There's a great deal you may not be aware of regarding this particular employee's history. I'm aware of her history, James said. I've been in this building for 7 days. That landed. Garrett looked at him. Then at the temporary badge on the table. Then back at James. And whatever he had been constructing as his next sentence dissolved. James looked at the group. All of them. He took a moment to do it properly. Not a scan, not an assessment. He looked at each person. My name is James Caldwell, he said. I own this company. I started it 18 years ago because I believed a business could take care of their people and still succeed. That doing right by the people who worked here and building something profitable were not opposing goals. He paused. I stopped verifying that belief against reality. I read reports instead of walking floors. I trusted people I should have been watching, and I let a system be built inside this company that has been doing significant harm to the people in this room. He looked at Diane Foster, standing, one hand on her back, watching him. That's on me, he said. I'm not here to pretend otherwise. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone, pressed play on a recording. Garrett's voice came from the speaker. Clear, unhurried, the voice of a man speaking in the confidence of a private conversation. The part-time classification just needs to stay in place. Corporate doesn't look at the actual clock records. They look at the filed classification. Keep her below the documented threshold and the insurance question resolves itself. That's not my problem. That's her problem. 30 seconds. Then a second voice on the recording, asking something that was partially obscured. Then Garrett again. If she files anything, I've got 4 months of documentation. Attitude issues, reliability concerns. By the time anyone looks at, she's already gone, and the record supports the decision. It's clean. James stopped the recording. The room was absolutely still. Garrett's professional surface was gone. What was underneath it was not rage, not remorse. It was the particular expression of a man running calculations and finding that none of them worked. "That's private conversation," he said. "You recorded me without. Michigan law requires one-party consent," James said. I was party to the conversation. The recording is legal." He tilted his head slightly. "But we can discuss the law in detail with corporate counsel, who is currently in the parking lot." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I've built the best numbers in this region for 4 years," he said. "Labor efficiency, overhead reduction, shrinkage control. Your numbers were built by taking money and benefits from the people in this room," James said. "I understand what they cost. I've spent a week learning it." He looked at Garrett directly. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Your access to all company systems was suspended at 9 a.m. this morning. 2 members of the security team are outside. They'll escort you from the building." He paused. "The wage theft documentation has been referred to federal investigators. As that process pursued its own timeline, independent of anything that happens here today." Garrett stared at him. "You can't do this without going through HR protocol." "I'm the CEO," James said, "and this is cause. We're done." The security team came through the employee entrance. 2 men, professional, quiet. They crossed the floor without urgency. Garrett looked at them, looked at James, looked at the room of 16 people watching him, and whatever argument he had been assembling, he left. Hard soles on tile, getting quieter, and then the sound of the back entrance opening and closing, and then nothing. The room breathed, all at once. A collective exhale. 16 people releasing something they had been holding without knowing they were holding it. James waited a moment, let the room settle. Then he looked at Diane Foster. "Sit, so," he said, "please, right now." Diane looked at the customer service chairs behind the desk, back at James. Then she walked around the desk and sat down. Slowly, with the careful deliberateness of 8 months of pregnancy, she lowered herself into the chair. She let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting for weeks. Someone near the back of the group made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something between the two that didn't have a name. James looked at Ruth. She was still standing at the table, her folder open in front of her, her hands resting on either side of it. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read and didn't try to. "Sandra Pruitt, our head of HR, is coming through that door in about 5 minutes," James said to the room. "She's going to sit down with each of you individually. If you've been affected by scheduling irregularities, misclassification, unpaid hours, or denied benefits, she needs to hear from you, every one of you. Nothing you say will result in any negative consequence to your employment. That is my commitment to you directly." He looked around the room one more time. "I know that a commitment from someone you just found out has been walking this floor for a week is not the same as trust," he said. "Trust gets built over time. I understand that. But I'm starting today, and I intend to continue." He stepped back and let the room become what it needed to become. Sandra arrived at 10:20 with 3 HR specialists and 2 laptops. And by 11, the break room had been converted into a processing center. A row of temporary stations where employees sat, privately, one at a time, and Sandra's team worked through the records with the methodical care of people doing important work. James stayed on the floor, not hovering, working, because the store needed to keep running, and the people in needed to see that this was not a disruption that required the ordinary work to stop. They were cashiers and stock clerks and maintenance staff, and their job still existed, still mattered, still needed to be done. James understood that. He had always understood that. He had just, for a while, stopped being close enough to it to remember. He fixed the lock on the East Wing supply closet at 11:15. It took 8 minutes. A replacement mechanism from the maintenance kit. A screwdriver, the specific attention that a thing required when you are actually paying attention to it. He tested it twice. It worked. He helped a customer find the correct voltage adapter for a lamp. He straightened the display in housewares that had been leaning at an angle that would eventually become a safety issue. He noted, and this time wrote it down in the actual system under his actual credentials, that the anti-fatigue mats were missing six stations on the main floor and needed to be replaced within 48 hours. At 1 o'clock, Sandra appeared beside him in the hardware section. "Ruth's ready to go through her file," she said. "How is she?" Sandra considered the question with the care she brought to everything. She's holding. She'll hold better once she hears the numbers." James went to the break room. Ruth was sitting at one of the temporary stations. Her folder was on the table beside her, still there, still open. The 4 months of documentation she had assembled alone. Sandra sat across from her with a laptop. James pulled up a chair and sat to the side, not between them. She's just present. Sandra walked Ruth through it. The reclassification, effective today, retroactive to the original hire date 3 years and 4 months ago. The back pay. Sandra put the number on the screen and turned the laptop so Ruth could see it. The insurance correction. The carrier's written commitment, which Sandra printed from her email and slid across table. "The authorization for Ava's surgery won't be instant," Sandra said. Her voice was direct and honest and kind all at once, which was what made her good at what she did. "Realistically, you'll have written confirmation by end of this week. I've spoken to the carrier directly. Given the documented fraud in your classification, they've agreed to treat this as a retroactive enrollment correction. Ava's case has been flagged as medical priority. The surgeon's office can proceed with scheduling as soon as you have the written confirmation, which I expect Thursday at the latest." Ruth looked at the printed commitment letter. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the back pay number on the screen. Then she looked at the reclassification document, with full-time permanent, where part-time temporary had been for 3.5 years. She pressed her lips together, breathed once through her nose. "Thursday," she said. "At the latest," Sandra said. "I'll personally follow up with the carrier every 4 hours until it's confirmed." Ruth nodded, once. Then she picked up the commitment letter and folded it carefully, not away, not out of sight. Carefully, like something she was going to carry with her. "Thank you," she said to Sandra. Then she looked at James. The look held a great deal that didn't need to be said and wouldn't have been improved by saying it. "Sandra's going to walk you through the rest," James said as "Be on the floor." He stood, moved to the door. "Jim," Ruth said. He turned. "James," she corrected herself, testing the name. "Thank you for not walking past the bathroom." He looked at her. "Thank you for being there to knock on," he said. He went back to the floor. At 3 in the afternoon, James went into Garrett's old office, closed the door, and called Victor Langley. Not the company line. The personal cell. The door under Victor with no last name, because there had been a time when no last name was necessary. Victor picked up on the second ring. "James." He said it without surprise, which confirmed that someone had called him already. Garrett, probably, from the parking lot. "Where are you?" James said. "My office." A pause. "I assume your people are on their way." "Corporate counsel is in the building. Your system access was suspended at 9 this morning." James was looking at the desk. At the things Garrett had left, a coffee mug, a charger, a sticky note with a phone number on it that meant nothing to James. "Victor, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." Silence. How long? A pause that went on long enough to be an answer in itself. "The initiative gave the structure," Victor said finally. His voice was even, controlled. The voice of a man who had decided, somewhere in the past 48 hours, what posture to hold when this conversation came. The individual managers executed it. I monitored the outcomes and managed the reporting. For how long? 2 years. A pause. More, at some locations. James sat with that. 2 years with 5 stores, 41 people, Sandra documented, and likely more that hadn't been captured yet because they had left, listed as voluntary resignations, disappeared from the records without anyone looking closely at why. The reports, James said, the internal reports, Dion Briggs's reports, were routed to my office for regional review. Victor's voice didn't change. I closed them. Why? A pause. Because the numbers worked, Victor said. Because I believed, I thought also, that the employees were still being paid, that they were still employed, that it was a classification issue, not. He stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something a man tells himself, James said, when he doesn't want to look directly at what he's doing. Silence. I'm not calling to argue with you, James said. Corporate counsel will handle what comes next. You know what that process looks like. He paused. I'm calling because 15 years is not nothing, and because I need you to understand something before the attorneys take over. He looked at the sticky note on Garrett's desk. The meaningless phone number. I seen the initiative, James said. I know that. I've known it all week. 45 seconds and my name on something I didn't for enough. And that gave you the tool and gave them the cover. He paused. I'm not telling you that to share the blame. I'm telling you because I've been sitting with it for a week, and I needed to say it to you directly. His voice stayed level, but something in it had weight now. Not anger, something older and less clean than anger. You knew me when I had nothing. You watched me build this. You knew exactly what I built it for, and you knew exactly who I built it for. And you used the trust I had in you to make it into something that hurt those people. Victor said nothing. That's the part I'll be carrying, James said. The legal part is the attorney's problem. That part is mine. He waited to see if Victor would say anything. Victor said, I'm sorry, James. The words were right. The tone was appropriate. James looked at the mug on Garrett's desk and thought about 15 years and about the front row on IPO day and about the way Victor had always known exactly what to say. I know, James said. He ended the call, sat in the office for a moment. Then he stood up, opened the door, and walked back out onto the floor. That evening, after Sandra's team had completed all 16 individual sessions and filed the initial documentation, after the legal team had confirmed the simultaneous actions at all 5 affected stores, after James had spent 2 hours walking the floor of his own store, just walking it, knowing it the way he now knew it. After all of that, he drove to Catherine's. He went in this time. Found the right corridor, the right room. Knock, Ruth answered the door. She had changed into actual clothes, not work clothes, and she looked different in a way that took him a moment to identify. Then he understood. She was standing without the particular set of shoulders that came from carrying something invisible and very heavy. It wasn't gone, nothing resolved in a single day, but it was different. Lighter by some measurable degree. Behind her, in the bed, was Ava, 8 years old. Dark hair spread on a pillow, a monitor attached to her chest, printing her heart's work in green lines across a screen, an IV line in her left arm. A stuffed rabbit tucked under her right arm, worn in the specific way that stuffed animals got worn when they had been carried everywhere for years. She was awake. She looked at James with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who had spent enough time around medical professionals to be completely unimpressed by unfamiliar adults. You're not a doctor, she said. No, James said. I'm not. Are you the person who helped my mom? James looked at Ruth briefly. Ruth gave him nothing, just waited to see what he would say. A lot of people helped your mom, he said. She did most of it herself. He looked at Ava. How are you feeling? Ava considered this with the seriousness it deserved. My chest hurts a little when I breathe deep. The doctor said that's from the monitoring equipment and it'll stop. She looked at the monitor beside her bed. I'm having surgery next week. Did you know that? I heard, James said. Mom cried when they told her. Ava looked at Ruth, the good kind. There are 2 kinds. There are, James agreed. Ruth was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes doing something she wasn't quite managing to control. She was looking at her daughter with the expression of a woman who has been holding a specific fear for a very long time and has just, for the first time, been allowed to set it down. James stood at the foot of the bed. He thought about the letter in his inside jacket pocket. His father's job application folded into quarters, protected by a plastic sleeve gone yellow at the edges. He had carried it in his jacket all week without thinking about it, carried it the way he carried it everywhere, the way he had carried it for 20 years. He didn't take it out, but he felt the weight of it. 13 years ago, his father's careful handwriting, maintenance and custodial services. He thought about every floor his father had cleaned in this city, every building that hadn't known his name. He thought about Ruth mopping a floor that was already clean, about Dion's 4 emails, 9 months, not stopping, about Diane Foster sitting on a stockroom floor because she needed to sit somewhere Garrett wouldn't see. He thought about what it cost. What it actually cost, paid out in the currency of daily indignity and exhaustion, and the slow erosion of a person's belief that the system they were inside had any interest in them at all. Ava, he said, you don't need to worry about the insurance or the surgery schedule. That's all being handled. Your mom's job is safe. Everything that was wrong is being fixed. Ava looked at him with those direct, considering eyes. How do you know? She asked. Not a challenge, genuine curiosity. Because I'm the person responsible for fixing it, he said, and I'm paying attention now. Ava thought about this, accepted it with the pragmatic trust of someone who had bigger things to manage than verifying adult claims. Okay, she said. James looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back. Everything that needed to be said between them had already been said, or would be said in time, or didn't need to be said because it was already understood. He had spent a week in her building, learning what she had known for 3.5 years. She had spent the seemsy something about him that she was still deciding what to do with. She nodded, small, certain, the nod of a woman who had stood in front of Garrett Shaw with a folder of 4 months of documentation and said, I am done being silent, who had done that alone, without knowing anyone was behind her, and who had meant every word of it. James nodded back. I'll let you two have the evening, he said. He said goodnight to Ava, who said goodnight back with the same frank efficiency with which she had said everything else. And he walked back down the hospital corridor and out through the main entrance and into the night air. He sat in the car, took the application out of his jacket pocket. His father's handwriting. The careful letters of a man who understood that how you wrote your name said something about how seriously you took the act of asking for something. James had built a company with this in his pocket, had made every large decision of his professional life with this paper within reach, had told himself it kept him honest, kept him grounded, kept him connected to where he came from. And then he had signed a document in 45 seconds without writing it and gone on to his next meeting. He looked at the handwriting for a long time. Then he folded it back into quarters, replaced it in the plastic sleeve, and put it back in his pocket. He started the car, drove back to the hotel. In the room, he sat at the small desk and called Sandra one last time. All 5 locations confirmed, he said. All 5. Actions completed, employees notified, reclassification processing underway. Federal referral confirmed received. She paused. James, there's one more thing I want to flag before you sleep. Go ahead. It's a supply closet lock. Store 14, East Wing. I got a maintenance request in the system this morning, priority flag, completed at 11:15 a.m. Her voice was dry in the specific way it got when she was saying something that mattered while pretending it was small. First maintenance request processed at Store 14 in 4 months. James was quiet for a moment. Start somewhere, he said. You started somewhere, Sandra said. He said goodnight and closed the laptop. Took off the work boots, someone else wrong size that had become his right one over 7 days, and set them by the door. Lay back on the bed. He thought about the morning, about walking into the store as himself for the first time, about the conversations ahead, with the board, with the press, with the 41 employees at 5 locations who deserved explanations and not just corrections. About the Workforce Flexibility Initiative and every other policy on the books that gave one person unchecked authority over another person's livelihood. About the reporting system that needed to be rebuilt to free the structure up so that the next Dean Briggs didn't spend 9 months sending emails into a void. He thought about all of it, the work of it, the long, unfinished daily work of building something that actually did what it said it did. Then he stopped thinking about it, thought instead about Ava's rabbit, worn soft from years of being carried everywhere. The green lines on the monitor reading her heart's steady work. Thought about Ruth's voice saying the good kind. There are 2 kinds. He reached over and turned off the lamp. In the dark, in a hotel room 3 miles from where he had grown up, James Caldwell closed his eyes. He was not finished. He knew that. Would know it every morning for a long time. There was no version of what this that ended cleanly, without remainder, without the ongoing work of changing not just what had gone wrong, but the conditions that had allowed it to go wrong and stay wrong for as long as it had. But tonight, for the first time in 7 days, he slept, deeply, without interruption. The sleep of a man who had put something down that needed to be put down and picked up something real in its place. In the morning, he would go back to the store, not as Jim Cole, as himself, which, he was beginning to remember, had always been the same person, just paying attention now.